Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. CMMC is here, now what? I'm Dominga Gundilak, and I'm a part of the Kahua marketing team. Before we get started with today's webinar, I'm going to go over a couple housekeeping items. If you have any questions you want to ask throughout the webinar, you can go ahead and drop them in the Q&A box, which I'm highlighting right now, so you should see that pop up on your screen. We will be leaving time at the end of the webinar to go over any questions. I also wanted to point out the related content section. Here we'll have provided additional content for you to enjoy, and we also included content related to today's discussion. I also wanted to mention that you are able to maximize or minimize the slides in case you want to see something better. And before I turn it over to today's speakers, we do have a couple poll questions for the audience, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the first one. Our first question is, what is your current familiarity with CMMC requirements? So you guys can go ahead and put in your answer choices. We have A, very familiar, B, somewhat familiar, C, just starting to learn, or D, not familiar at all. So I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a couple seconds to put in your answer so we can get a better idea of where everyone's at. I see a couple coming in, so I'm going to give it a few more seconds just to give everyone an opportunity to answer. Okay, cool. I'm going to go ahead and go over the results. Okay, so it looks like we have a little bit of everything, but it looks like most of you guys have at least heard about it or are somewhat familiar. So let's go ahead and move on to poll question number 2. How prepared is your organization to meet CMMC requirements? So same thing here. You guys can go ahead and put in your answer choices. We have A, fully prepared, B, partially prepared, C, planning to start soon, or D, not started yet. So go ahead and put in those answer choices. Okay, I'm starting to see a couple come in, so I'm going to leave it open a few more seconds just to give everyone an opportunity to answer. Okay, looks like a few more are trickling in, so I'm going to give it a couple more seconds before I close it. All right, I'm going to go ahead and show the results. Oh, same thing here. It looks like we have a couple of different answer choices. So thank you guys for participating in that. And with that being said, I'm going to introduce today's speaker. For the webinar, we have Nicholas Johnson. He's the Chief Evangelist with Kahua, and he'll be taking it over from here. Hey, Nicholas.
Thank you, Dominga. I appreciate that. And welcome, everyone. We're glad to be with you this afternoon. I'm Nicholas Johnson. I'm the Chief Evangelist at Kahua. And today, because our world is being governed and managed in cyberspace, we're here to talk about CMMC. Because of our world being managed this way, the DoD has decided that they need to put in place more stringent requirements and governance. So they've rolled out, or they've introduced to the world, CMMC, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So I'm glad to have a panel of experts with me. I want to welcome everyone, and we're just going to start with some introductions. We're joined today by my colleague from Kahua and by my colleagues from Schellman. So I'm going to start by asking Marcy, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about what you do for Schellman, and we'll go from there.
Awesome. Thanks, Nicholas. Happy to be here. So appreciate everyone in the audience. I'm Marcy Womack. I'm a managing director here at Schellman. I sit primarily in our federal practice. Overall, Schellman is a cybersecurity assessment firm. To sum it up very simply, we perform any sort of third-party assessment, certification, accreditation, and so forth in terms of any cybersecurity standards. So FedRAMP, obviously CMMC, which is why we're here today, SOC, ISO, HIPAA, high trust, pen testing, the list goes on. So, as I mentioned, I sit in our federal practice. So, I work a lot with my colleague who's here today, Tim, and our team on the FedRAMP side, on the CMMC side. So we're a FedRAMP 3 PAO, we're a CMMC C3 PAO. Lots of acronyms, so we'll do our best to kind of lay off that where we can, or define them at least. And we have been a C3 PAO since 2021, and we've performed a few joint surveillance assessments and have been very engaged in the ecosystem. So we're really excited to talk about some of the big milestones that have happened and are happening in the CMMC space. So Tim, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Marcy. I'm Tim Walsh. I'm a federal practice manager with Schellman. As Marcy said, work closely alongside her. I primarily manage a lot of the gap and readiness projects in preparation for CMMC, and which will be the inevitable certificate of status assessments as well. And alongside with the FedRAMP assessment program and cloud service providers who are seeking authorization. Prior to joining Schellman, I worked as a systems engineer for defense contractors specializing in the design of physical security systems. So I have a little bit of perspective on both sides of the fence. So I'll hand it off to the next presenter here.
Colin, that's you.
Yes, that's me. And my three-letter acronym, I'm the CTO of Kahua, and I oversee the technology, whether it's the design, the architecture of what we have, and the security side, and also the product that we offer, as well as run the operations side of the house as well. And I'm actually Kahua's first employee, and started on the commercial side, but then we moved over and included and developed our solution that it works in the federal space, the federal network, just about 3 years ago. And we'll get into that in a little bit here, but I'm happy to be on this today.
All right, so Colin, that's wonderful. You've told us a little bit about the work you do with and for Kahua. What do you do after work?
I relax and it's in a good way in that, I live up in Maryland, and that's where my base is, but I'm frequently down here in Atlanta where our headquarters are, but also around the around the United States, but also internationally, visiting our customers, and with some of our employees that are out around about the world. And one of the exciting things, the reason I live in Annapolis is I love the water. So for anybody that's up in the space, up in DC, and you'll hear me talk quite a bit about the local area up there in Annapolis.
Excellent. All right, Tim, when you're not working, what do you like to spend your time doing?
Listening to music, and I like to play with I have a couple puppies who certainly keep us busy. But outside of that, it's mostly music focused and relaxing, watching some sports.
All right, what's your genre?
That would have to be alternative or indie, a little bit of hip hop in there every so often.
All right, Marcy, what do you do when you're not keeping the world secure?
I was gonna say after work, like when does work end? That's a joke, but timely. No, I live in Colorado, so I really like to do things outdoors. We have 2 new kittens that we're enjoying, and I'm also a huge college sports person, so we do a lot of gallivanting around watching college sports around the country. So,
all right, who's your team?
It depends a little bit. Nebraska volleyball, Arizona men's basketball, for softball, kind of all over. But my alma mater is a Division II school in Texas, West Texas A&M, so I follow them really closely.
All right, excellent. All right, well, thank you guys all for being with us today. Marcy, we're going to come right back to you with the first question. And I want to ask you simply to give us some definitions. Now, I was going to ask if you would just tell us what CMMC is and why it's important. But you also, you brought up some Star Wars creatures in your opening remarks. You said C3PO, I believe. No, that's not exactly what you said, but define the terms that we're going to use today. Let's start with CMMC.
Of course, happily. And I feel like this could be an hour-long webinar in and of itself. So I will do my best to kind of scratch the surface. So in essence, CMMC is a cybersecurity maturity model certification. I know we've got folks in the audience that have knowledge and comfort with the idea of CMMC. It has had many lives in the last 5 years, and many stops and starts, and just a few like iterations, I would say. But really the idea is that there is sensitive data that's pervasive and prevalent and necessary to be shared throughout the defense industrial base, whether that's a term called FCI, Federal Contract Information, or CUI, Controlled and Classified Information, that needs to be protected. And back in 2016, 2017, there was a new NIST standard, NIST 800-171, that was stood up with the idea of protecting controlled and classified information. It was a set of 110 controls that was derived from the larger kind of federal control standard, NIST 800-53, which we all live and breathe daily. And the idea is, again, that it was a set of controls that was tailored for the supply chain, the defense supply chain, as well as any non-federal system that's handling that type of data, just to ensure that there's adequate confidentiality protection for that. So when fast forward a few years, I mentioned 2016, 2017, that was a while ago, which is hard to believe, but I don't know that it really had the effect that was intended. There was still sensitive data that was getting out to adversaries, other nation states, et cetera. Part of the concern was that NIST 800-171 didn't have a required third-party assessment component to it. So organizations were really allowed to self-assess. There weren't a ton of checks and balances in terms of, hey, you said you're doing this, are you actually doing this? And CMMC is really a certification program around the existing controls and the existing standard to give more teeth and bite to it, to ensure that, hey, this data really is being protected, and that type of thing. So again, the focus is those two types of data, so FCI and CUI. And CMMC happens across 3 levels. So there's level 1, level 2, and level 3. We'll kind of talk about that a little bit in more detail later,
okay.
But really level 1 was where we focus on FCI. Most of the conversations that we have as a C3PAO, I'll define that in a second, are around level 2, because that is really the bulk of hey, you've got CUI in your organization, you've got your customer is emailing it to you, how do you protect it, what do you do? That all falls into level 2, and that's what is going to require that C3PAO, so CMMC third-party assessment organization assessment. So that's where we as Schellman come in. We're CCAs, we have the right certifications to perform that type of work. We are the right accredited or authorized entity to perform that work. And we come in and perform that third-party assessment. So those are kind of, I would say, the 30,000-foot view. And then I think we'll sprinkle in more. Did I hit that from your perspective, Nicholas? Anything you want me to touch on further?
Just a clarity, NIST is the National Institute of Science and Technology. And can you give us an example of the 2 kinds of data and documents we're talking about, CUI and FCI?
Yeah. So FCI, I don't love because it's a really wishy-washy definition. It's less clear, and I like definitive things. That's why I'm an auditor, right? But FCI is really any sort of information that's not CUI, so it's not specifically labeled or considered to be CUI, but is also sensitive and pertaining to a contract. So it could be like a contract itself. It could be other types of data. And there's another standard that focuses on that. But anyway, FCI is a bit broad. CUI is much more honed in a little bit, I would say. So it typically is going to have a specific label assigned to that. There are specific CUI categories. So NARA, oh my gosh, I just blanked on the spelled out version of that agency, but it's the records administration, basically. They've defined the CMMC, excuse me, the CUI categories. And DoD also has their own CUI category definition. So
okay.
A lot more to read on that, of course, and we can also share out those websites later.
And those are the details that your team helps people identify internally. And okay, all right, that makes good sense.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Colin, I'm going to turn to you because it's bound to come up pretty quickly in this conversation. So will you tell the audience what FedRAMP is, where it applies, and why it's important?
Yep. So the easy one here for FedRAMP is the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program. And what that is, it is intended for CSPs to provide their services to the federal government. And what's important here, it applies to all agencies and is standardized, meaning that all agencies should be applying to. You've seen a lot of legal and more standard and compliance requirements coming along for it for all agencies. But at its heart, it's based on a set of controls that need to be adhered to. What's important where it crosses over into CMMC is it's based off NIST 800-53. And there are some enhanced controls for being a CSP. But at its core, the control set is from 800-53, and so is CMMC. And I think Marcy said there's additional things. Things were cleaned up as we get to 2.0 here, and you go up through the levels. But at its core, you've got the same controls and the same control set. And so it's important because if you can satisfy a significant amount of CMMC 2.0 requirements by utilizing a system that is FedRAMP authorized. Such as ours here at Kahua, because the control sets, they're either nearly identical or are identical or nearly identical, and there might be some customer responsibilities that you need to adhere to. So there's quite a bit of overlap, and then you'll see a lot of these publications that you talk to will mention both in the same sentence as you go through all the documentation.
All right, so CSP is a cloud service provider. Kahua is a CSP, and we've achieved FedRAMP authorization. What was that process like, obtaining that authorization?
So that process, overall, there's two ways to start the process. You can either be a system that has a sponsor, which means there's an agency out there that will allow you to use your solution as a CSP, but you've never, you're not FedRAMP authorized. There's something called JAB, where you actually don't have a sponsor, but you'd still like to offer your services. So you start one or the other. We actually started at the JAB, and we were just going to get ourselves in position to be a CSP for the federal government. However, we had GSA. So as you have to have a system that is authorized and adheres to all the controls. Our target for FedRAMP was FedRAMP moderate. There are 3 levels: low, moderate, and high. So we started moderate, and so it's a majority of the controls, about 75% of them from NIST 800-53. It has to be controls. Some customers that could be something where factor authentication. Kahua actually provides that. What we have, if you so choose to use, you can have your own identity provider, and then it is your responsibility as a customer to actually have multi-factor authentication enabled, because we aren't able to confirm that ourselves. That's a customer responsibility. But you have this system, you have all these controls. There's 327 that we actually implemented. And then once you have those in place, you've got them documented, then you move to assessment. And that's where you have an organization such as Schellman as a 3PAO come in and do an assessment to see, make sure that all these controls are implemented as the control requirements are from NIST 800-53, as well as that they are documented. And then once you get through assessment, and effectively you have to pass your assessment, your controls, you can't have everything undone. Just say, hey, you know what, they just didn't do it. You got to get everything done and implemented and documented. Then you go and get your authorization, and that's where the PMO, Project Management Office, will come along, take a look at the assessment, and then they will do whether you're meeting. Will get an authorization, but it doesn't end there. Once you're authorized, you have you have to do annual assessments. 1/3 of the controls are reassessed. So in 3 years, you're actually looking at every control program. But you also have obligations. One is you have to do monthly continuous monitoring reporting. You actually have to do really down to real-time monitoring some systems, some of the controls that are out there, particularly for network scanning. But you are always doing scanning. You're always tracking. You're looking at things like your SIM, your Security Information Event Management System or monitoring system. And then you are working with the government, wanting to report on that, and they'll take a look and work with you to make sure everything's working as designed. It's the inevitable. There are the bad actors of the world. They are always coming up with new attacks. There's new threat vectors. And so the government will actually, 2 things. One, they do a very good job of actually being on top of what's happening. There's a lot of 0-day, meaning same day attacks happening that they are already out and talking to us. We're tapped into a variety of channels that say, hey, this is something that's happening and occurring in the world. I'm going to have to mitigate it. But they also do something called data calls to figure out, hey, is your system is at risk, or could it potentially be at risk in the future? The bad actors never sleep. We know that. It's nonstop, 24/7, which is when you asked earlier what I did. But downtime, relax. It's relaxed, but got to be always have our systems in place so that we can make sure if anything occurs that we're defending against it. But it is as you can tell from just what I've gone over here, it's a very involved process. You can't just throw any system out there. It has to be built from the ground up with these types of controls in mind. I always tell people FedRAMP is really best practices from a security standpoint. And it's always all the time. So you must have a system that is incorporating security best practices, and it needs to be well documented. You have to, and again, this is out there. Like for Kahua, we're providing a service. We're a service provider, and so we're actually providing a product there. So one, we got to adhere to all these controls, but we also have to provide a product. So the Kahua that our entire platform is FedRAMP authorized. It's not just a certain subset, or there's customer responsibilities that say, hey, these entire features applications aren't allowed. Our entire platform is actually authorized. We're going to maintain that. Made that a very lengthy process because that means that every single thing has to be looked at. Every single thing has to be involved. We began our journey on Cinco de Mayo, May 5th of 2018, and we received our authorization in first quarter of 2022. So throughout those years, we were working on making sure that our systems worked as required and also fully documented.
All right, you said a lot there. I'm going to try to pull a couple nuggets out. First of all, in the end, almost 4 years to achieve this authorization. Any significant glitches there, or is that just what the process took?
What the process took, and we our entire platform for our authorization. And so, one, we did things. We weren't but it that took for those that looked at some things. We have two networks: a commercial network and a government network. We are just built on a government network in order to be tailored towards the federal government and public sector. We have in addition to that, it's actually something and so we're able to have use the government network. So we began by having our government-oriented network, and we built that up. We do use, and for those non-commercial folks that may be out there, commercial network actually runs the same exact system. So all of our
Colin, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you because your audio is cutting out really bad. So I'm going to come back to you in a minute and ask that question again. For now, I'm going to turn to Tim and ask Tim, now that we understand what CMMC is, and Colin's given us a bit of a description of the process of getting FedRAMP, what's the process like obtaining the certification that is CMMC? We've got contractors in our audience, subcontractors, specialty contractors. Tell them what that process is going to look like if they want to be one of those specialty contractors or contractors in the defense industrial base that has this certification, which effectively is going to allow them to work going forward.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Nicholas. Certainly, in looking in the lens of this overview at level 2, right? Because they're primarily looking at CUI. And really, the document that's going to help to govern that process is what's referred to as the CAP. It's the CMMC assessment process. So that's something that's undergoing remediation and review right now between the Cyber AB and the DoD that will, effectively, finalize what that is. But after reading the Title 32 rule, which calls out the CMMC assessment program, there are effectively 4 phases at a high level to be aware of as it pertains to that process. So in the initial engagement with your C3PAO, let's assume, because there is the level 2 self-assessment. So this is talking about a level 2 assessment with the C3PAO. Assuming that you've executed a contractual agreement and that's been, signed off with both parties, there will likely state, the various milestones associated with each phase of the assessment process. The C3PO will likely give you a request list that says, hey, here's the artifacts that we're looking to see as a part of the assessment. That can include observations, things that they want to see live as opposed to screenshots of, showing maybe just some audit records from a particular system, but actually seeing, for instance, the authentication process in play. So under phase one, once you start to dive into that, is really where you get into a lot of those scoping activities. And certainly when you do that contracting process, there will be scoping discussions as a part of that. But this is really where you dive in with the assessors, the lead CCA and the CCAs that are on the project, and being able to define that scope, the organization that is, in that the C3PO would have processes to validate that scope and looking at your SSP, the system security plan, the diagrams, which should help to delineate and outline the CUI flow, as well as the inventory. That includes all of the assessments and scope as it pertains to the scoping guides, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, an organization may delay to continue with the next phases if, readiness, is not determined or does not bode well for a successful assessment. So, it's a great idea to engage early as a part of that process to make sure whether or not, you're ready to proceed as part of the, the follow-on phases. Now, there are some pre-assessment artifacts that you'll have going into this process that will need to be handled and uploaded to what is referred to as CMMC EMAS, and that's going to be, where those deliverables are uploaded. Ultimately, there's going to be a determination out of that, and then the ability for the C3PO to generate the relevant certificate of status that we'll dive in here in a minute. So under phase two, this is where you get into the field work of the assessment itself. This could be in person. There are some requirements that you do have to assess in person. So if you have a physical footprint, whether that's offices, data, labs, co-location data centers, factories, areas that do have to be assessed in person against those relevant physical controls, those have to be done in person. But otherwise, let's say you're a member of the DIB and you have an environment that's strictly in a cloud IaaS provider, well, that's a good candidate to conduct that assessment remotely, because a lot of those physical controls you're inheriting from that respective cloud service provider. And so, where the contractor scope, and you're looking at that, it's to be able to say, as part of sampling, and a lot of that will likely be called out in that CMMC assessment process to say, what areas do need to be assessed against that relative to, are there unique implementations that they have to review, or are there, several cage codes, but maybe there's a common implementation across all those that can be assessed once. So some considerations there. Now, under phase two, the output of that is, trying to achieve what they refer to as a conditional certificate of status. And when you go through the assessment, there are 3 strict criteria that they have outlined in the Title 32 rule. One being that you have to achieve a minimum of 80% on the assessment. So they have a scoring methodology that's in the Title 32 rule, which, you ultimately, divide the number of requirements by the scoring they have to get to that minimum of 80%. The second criteria deals with, there are values associated with each security requirement. So out of the 110 controls in the 800-171 standard, they all assigned a value of 1, 3, or 5. And that's very similar to what organizations may be used to under the existing DoD assessment methodology and SPUR scoring, the supplier performance risk system, in which they enter that, score in there. So those controls that have a value of 3 or 5, those must be met as a part of the assessment. There are a few exceptions to that where explicitly the controls dealing with FIPS validated cryptography. There may be some ways to continue if you do have encryption in place, but it's not FIPS validated, and there's processes that can go alongside that to how you handle those operational plans of action, what they refer to in the Title 32 rule. And then also with MFA, multi-factor authentication, where if your privileged users have MFA in place, but maybe non-privileged do not, that's also a candidate for a potential 3 or 5 control that could be given partial credit. Now, the third requirement, a strict criteria, I should say, out of that is that there are 6 requirements in particular, agnostic of those values, that must be met as a part of this process. So one of those in particular is the system security plan, which really, outlines the scope of what the environment is to be assessed. It should include, your diagrams, things that help to define what implementations you have relative to all those controls, how you're meeting them, who's the responsible parties that are helping to meet those. And so that would have to be met, as a huge critical control as a part of that process. Now, assuming that you hit all three of those criteria, the minimum of 80%, 3 or 5 being met, and those 6, critical controls, that allows you to be eligible for that conditional certificate of status, and that's issued by your C3PAO. Now, what happens at that point is you dive into that phase 4 process. Now, that phase 4 process is allowing for remediation of that. And so, if you are deemed eligible, you achieve that conditional certificate of status, you have 180 days to go and address those gaps that, outside of that criteria, what they refer to as those POAMs, plan of action and milestones. And you would have to go address those and have your C3PO come back to validate those within the 180-day period. If out of that remediation period of assessment, they determine that you have now met and you will now have a perfect score or a perfect compliance with the 171 standard, then you're eligible to receive a final certificate of status from your C3PAO.
And it's that gap analysis you mentioned before. That's one of the things that is your specialty at Schellman.
It is, yeah. We do a number of gap assessments, readiness assessments for those organizations that maybe they're curious as to where they stand in the process. They could have been members of the DIB for a long time, or those maybe who are interested in doing business with the DoD.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. That's really helpful to understand. It's a very detailed process, and obviously you've got it down pat, it sounds like. I'm going to go back to Colin, but Tim, I'm going to come back to you with the same question. Colin, we're going to try and see if we can get a little better audio from you this time. My question is this: Kahua is one of a very few project management information systems that is FedRAMP authorized. In your opinion, how can a FedRAMP authorized solution help a contractor achieve CMMC?
All right. So first, I'll be paying attention to the chat, and if my voice breaks up, I apologize for it. Good, bad networking connection. But I will definitely follow up. We'll get some information out to folks if we can't get this through. But how it helps is what I was going through earlier is that because we are a FedRAMP authorized solution, we adhere to the same base control set that CMMC does. So for anything that we have the controls that we implement as a CSP that can be inherited under those that are looking to achieve CMMC, we're going to have that already implemented for you. It's part of how you implement the control for your CMMC compliance. So again, it can be upwards of the exact percentage, and I can't say if it's 72 or 68%. It's going to vary a bit by your organization, but a majority of your controls can be achieved by utilizing Kahua for the technology side and for the data storage. And Marcy mentioned earlier, your controlled unclassified information is what CMMC is about. That is something that the Kahua product itself fully supports. So when you're working with applications, you can flag them as CUI, and then anything controls that are required of CUI data are going to be satisfied. So that gives you a significant, really, you can say a head start, or it can give you just I don't want to use the word shortcut, because again, you have to have your organization become CMMC compliant. But you're going to have difficult controls of doing the technology side of storage, encryption, and transit.
All right. So, Tim, let me turn back to you. If the controls are inherited, and I heard each of you talk about documentation of those controls, I assume the documentation can also be inherited or implied. So Tim, should a FedRAMP product like Kahua, should it reduce the scope of the process of CMMC? What's your take on that?
Well, so when you're looking at the confines of a CMMC assessment and using a cloud service provider, what they had outlined in the Title 32 rule is that if you are using a cloud service provider to handle CUI, right, on your behalf, then they have to demonstrate FedRAMP moderate authorization or equivalency via the DoD's memo that they put out in December of 2023. And so a part of that process, yes, there certainly can be a reduction into, what is needed as a part of an assessment. But ultimately, a lot of that responsibility does fall to the CSP to meet those requirements, whether it's authorization or equivalency. What I will say is that in either case, whether you're talking about a FedRAMP authorized platform or even in what the DoD calls out in their memo, there's the aspect of what they call a CRM, which is a customer responsibility matrix. And so all those cloud service providers that you're employing should be able to provide that to you as a customer of their product, to be able to say, hey, here's some of the requirements that you're responsible for as a part of using this product, to be able to meet certain requirements. And that could have an impact on your CMMC assessment.
Okay. Marcy, I'm going to turn to you with a little different question. And I'm actually going to take part of a question or a question from our audience. We intend to do Q&A at the end of this presentation, but there's one that applies to what I wanted to ask you next. And what I was going to ask is simply, what's the rollout going to look like? I've read that some requirements will go into place as early as the 16th of this month. Is that true? And what do we know about forthcoming projects? Can you explain how this is going to roll out? And the question from the audience, from James Dark, is there a list of agencies that will require this certification to do business with, or is that still pending as well? So I know that's a lot, Marcy, so I'm going to give you the floor for a minute.
Perfect. No, thanks for setting it up really well. And I think we have a slide, if we can pop over to that. So I don't expect everyone to read this while I'm talking. I'm going to hit some high points in this chart. And for this is really a summary of a pretty detailed section of the Title 32 CMMC rule. So it's section 170. Yes.
Just going to jump in to tell the audience, Marcy really means that you don't have to read this. We'll provide this. We're going to put a link in the chat.
Correct.
So you guys can get this chart. It's an eye chart for sure. So
yeah,
don't
totally
feel like you have to read along with Marcy's answer here.
Thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. And just so y'all know kind of the source of the data, it's section 170.3 in the rule. Just if you want to look it up, it's a summary here. But really what this is looking at is so CMMC is going to have a phased implementation. It is 4 phases over 3 years. And this will kind of get to, James, your question, and I'll kind of circle back to that as well. So what we would anticipate is that any DoD contract that is anticipated to handle CUI or require CUI, et cetera, is going to have a CMMC requirement written into that RFP, written into the contract, and it's going to happen in this phased approach. So one of the big kind of caveats is that the phased implementation starts when a secondary CMMC rule goes into effect, or is final, excuse me. So there is a kind of complementary CMMC rule. It's a Title 48 rule, and it's currently in proposed status. Whenever that goes final is when these phases essentially kick off. So we're still waiting on that. We've heard rumors that it might be early 2025. We're not totally sure, but you can see kind of starting with phase 1. So each of these are a year long. So phase 1 starts, let's just say, I don't know, March. If 48 CFR goes final in March, then that's when phase 1 would start, 2025. And then, that would end in March 2026, and then we would start phase 2. But you can see it's kind of, if you look at the levels 1, 2, and 3, it's a step down process. And so starting in phase 1, you'll see that there are level 1, which are just self-assessment requirements for the level 1 controls. It's just 15 controls, and they're considered like basic cybersecurity hygiene type controls. Those would be, a level 1 self-assessment, and that process would be required of the organization that is bidding on that contract. All those level 1 requirements would have to be met, and all of the kind of self-assessment process complete prior to contract award. And then, there are instances, I noted like an optional deviation, that it's possible that a level 2 a level 2 C3PAO assessment may be required in some limited instances. I think my guess is DoD really wanted some leeway to be able to add that in if they really felt it was necessary. But for example, you'll see that kind of that baseline, and they all build on each other. They're sequential. Right. So the baseline is that you'll have level 1, you'll have level 2 self, and then you'll have level 2 C3PAO where applicable. This is all determined by the contracting officer and the entity that is really like issuing, and that the that the DIB contractor is contracting with. So I would encourage everyone where possible to have conversations if things are unclear through that process. I think it's going to be really iterative as this rolls out. There's going to be a learning curve. I hope there's an opportunity to kind of build on that and take feedback. So when we think about who and like what agencies are going to require this follows the data. So it's very data centric, right? So we talked about this idea of CUI. So for any DoD contractor, subcontractor, and further down the supply chain, if they're handling CUI as part of their performance of that contract, whatever component they're doing, they're going to have CMMC at some of these levels. And that's going to be, we couldn't say which level. If they're handling CUI, then it's certainly level 2. But it might be level 2 self-assessment, or it might be level 2 C3PAO. There's going to be some leeway there that would be defined in the RFP and in the contracting process. So, there's not a list of agencies. You should assume that if it's a defense contract and it's for the DIB, like this is gonna, and you're handling CUI, then CMMC level 2 is going to be required. Where it gets a little wishy-washy, and I think we'll see this over time, is we've seen interest from non-DoD agencies who are interested in adopting CMMC. There are some agencies who kind of push 171 that we've seen more than others. And so I would anticipate that they probably adopt CMMC, but only time will tell on that. Really right now that the focus is DoD and the DoD supply chain.
Okay, so you said that effective almost immediately, new contracts can require level 1. That will be up. You said there's some discretion of the contracting officer.
Correct.
A year from now, they can require level 2.
Not quite. So let me rephrase. The challenge with this is there's no set timeline. Like we don't have the start date. The start date hasn't been defined. So there's the
other than level 1 this month.
No, not quite. So let me clarify. And I apologize. This is like really nuanced, and I'm trying to figure out how I can portray it better.
That's why we're doing this webinar.
I know, right? I know. Exactly. So all of this is predicated on the 48 CFR rule going final, and we don't know when that will go final. As soon as it goes final, that's when phase 1 starts. So if it goes final in January, that's when phase 1 would start, which is that milestone you were referencing, Nicholas, like for, at minimum level 1. But it could be March, it could be July. We have no idea, but that is really that trigger for all of these other things to start happening in sequence. Okay.
And whose court is that ball in?
The man behind the curtain and Wizard of Oz reference of the rulemaking process. I wish I knew more. Actually, I don't want to know more about rulemaking.
Okay, fair enough. Tim, I'm going to turn to you. And let's just say that, let's assume these things are coming forward rapidly. And let's assume that I'm a contractor who's done a lot of work, or at least a fair amount of work on DoD-related projects. And I want to continue to grow that part of my business. How do I start? If I haven't started yet, how do I start pursuing CMMC? Do you have like some opening recommendations?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, certainly I think when you look at existing contractors as part of the DIB, they've been having to meet requirements under DFAR 7012 for a number of years now. Now, that doesn't mean that an organization may need additional assurances to make sure that they're on the right track for CMMC. As we know, as a part of this webinar, we're focusing on NIST 800-171 as the standard at level 2 to really, meet those requirements. But, as we talked about in that assessment process, there are some nuances to that. There are areas that certainly you should be considering. And a lot of that you can really gather from that this assessment guides. We talked about the scoping guides in terms of the different categories. There are things they talk about with CY assets and security protection assets, areas that have a different frame of mind than maybe you were not used to in the past when you were self-attesting in SPRS. So I think reading those scoping guides, the assessment guides, there's also the DoD posted some CMMC FAQs on their webpage as well, helping to clarify some of these areas. I think certainly everyone should go read that and help to clarify some of those areas. Now, bigger picture in terms of outside of reading those guides, really start engaging with the ecosystem early. And what I mean by that is the CMMC ecosystem. So when you have questions and you want to bring those to RPOs who really can help from an advisory consulting perspective, and those are shown on the Cyber AV marketplace. And then in Schellman's case, us as a C3PAO, those who can help to perform assessments and even from a readiness perspective as well. And really, when you engage with the ecosystem, you can help to understand some of those expectations ahead of time. So as we said, an RPO who may be able to assist you with implementation or help drafting documentation, or even revamping your documentation. Once again, maybe you had documentation for 171, your self-assessment prior, but for CMMC, you're looking to take a different point or a different vantage. And so, really reaching out to those RPOs to get that guidance. And then us as a C3PO, today we perform a number of gap or mock assessments. We have a few different ways that we can help organizations. Now, we don't provide any sort of advisory or consulting, but our assessments, either from a gap assessment perspective, those findings would be detailed, enough for an organization to be able to ascertain, hey, we have a gap here, this is how we need to go fix it. And then you can choose to decide to enlist the help of an RPO or address internally. So, we have gap assessments that focus around the design of those controls relative to the NIST 800-171 standard. Those are more so interview-based, really, interviewing those control owners, those POCs, right, and help to validate those scoping decisions. And then, we could do a mock assessment, amongst that as well, which would be more along the lines of trying to mirror what would be a CMMC assessment, but not for score, of course, but looking at the implementation of those controls relative to the 800-171 standard. A lot of those same things within interviewing control owners or POCs, but looking how you're implementing those controls relative to the standard, looking at detailed evidence artifacts to say, yeah, you are on the right track, you've met this control, you've partially met this because one objective is not met. And that can help to support those self-assessments you may have done in the past.
Okay, so let's just say that I achieve it, I get through all this, I've got my certification. What else do I have to do? Are there, I believe you said earlier, there are continuous improvement or monitoring or auditing requirements. Just briefly, can you tell us about those?
Yeah, absolutely. So, talking about at level 2 in terms of a C3PO-led assessment that Marcy was referring to in that slide there, that's required every 3 years. And it's on you as a contractor, though, to perform those self-assessments, so what they refer to as a self-affirmation on a yearly basis. So that includes the years you go and have a C3PO perform an assessment, and also those out-of-band years as well. So on the lines of continuous monitoring, outside of that scope of what we just talked about, you need to make sure that you're effectively meeting the controls based on those organization-defined parameters. So if you and your system security plan have said, we're doing this quarterly, well, you need to make sure to keep up with what that quarterly cadence is of whatever control you've defined. A lot of those controls are organization-defined. It's really on the organization to make sure that you're meeting that on a basis, and then you can prove 2 or 3 POWs a part of those assessments that you've been keeping up with that from a maturity perspective.
So now, for our audience, the big point here is you're not one and done. You are always working on keeping things up to date and up to speed.
That's right. Yep.
Okay. Good place to start would be this gap analysis that Schellman can provide, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. That can certainly help organizations just to see where they stand, areas they need to address for remediation, and maybe they're in a good spot, and that's a good confirmation of that as well.
All right, Colin, I'm going to come back to you. Because you talked about the inherited controls and the inherited documentation, you also said that FedRAMP requires us to be continuously monitored and frequently audited. So I assume that those inheritance continue, they're linked, they're live. Does that help the CMMC certified contractor?
Yep, absolutely, yes. So the inheritance means, so one, you're inheriting the controls from us. So you're relying on us for the control implementation. So we must adhere to it. And if you're inheriting it, you will as well. And for what you're referring to, there's a couple of things. One, it's ongoing. It doesn't stop. So one, we've got these things that must be done, the monthly conmons, for example. And we're going to continue to do those because it's our requirement. But there's also something else. There over time, different revisions come out, and there are changes to the controls. We're currently on revision 5. And that is something we moved to this year. And there were, I believe it was about 80 different control enhancements and changes or, change sets to the controls. And so we had to, for this is, to be authorized for revision 5, we actually had to make those changes. Some things were the strength of passwords that was increased in certain areas. And others might be the ciphers or encryption methods were changed. So we made those changes. And then because of inheritance, you then inherit that we have implemented that control properly. So you will not have to do that for CMMC because you inherited it.
FedRAMP authorized facility. Does that actually meet the FedRAMP standard?
Nicholas, you were actually muted for the beginning of that question.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you, Dominga. Colin, did you get that? I'll repeat it. I've heard of
the question, but let's do that for the audience so I can answer it.
Yeah, the question is that I've heard of contractors using non-FedRAMP compliant software. So it's software that is not FedRAMP authorized, but housing it in a FedRAMP authorized physical facility. Does that actually meet the FedRAMP standard?
No, it doesn't. The only way it would is if you are all things, any customer responsibility you also implement, and then whatever software you're using isn't violating any of those controls that you're required to apply to. To give you an example of this, one thing you can do is Azure and AWS, their cloud service, they provide cloud infrastructure. They are FedRAMP authorized for their services, and you actually have controls from them that you can inherit, but you also have a lot of customer responsibilities. Some of them may be for MFA, for example. And so going down that route, if you have a solution or if you have a piece of software out there, has nothing never, FedRAMP has never thought of security as something where they just literally have a static username and password. If you took that and you put that on Azure, which does have a FedRAMP authorization, well, you don't have MFA in place. All right, so you're not adhering to the control. You're not meeting the control requirement to have an MFA. So therefore, it's invalid. If you got assessed on that, you will not pass. And so you cannot just simply take anything off the shelf and then put it on infrastructure. That's not, unless it's already built with the control requirements already met, then it is not going to be meeting it. You will not be, you'd fail an assessment and you would fail an authorization.
Okay, Marcy, I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up then. If a CMMC client was relying on FedRAMP for controls and for documentation, and they are in that non-compliant environment that Colin just described, I assume that means they're failing their CMMC requirements as well.
Bad news bears. Yes. So I love this question because there's been like some shift with the final rule that was published, and and clarity provided. And so really what organizations that are expecting to have CMMC or, adhere to CMMC, what they should really be focused on is what external services and service providers are handling CUI. Like, where are they moving CUI to an external service provider, whether that's a managed service provider or a cloud service provider. So in the context of cloud, because that's obviously what we're talking about here, if they're putting it in a cloud service offering that's not FedRAMP authorized or FedRAMP equivalent, then they're going to have a control failure for a control that can't be POAM'd. And then that goes into the conversation that Tim had earlier. And so, FedRAMP authorization, and I completely agree with you, Colin, in terms of like FedRAMP authorization is not inheritable, right? Like, just because you deploy a SaaS onto AWS or OCI or anyone, it doesn't mean that SaaS is automatically FedRAMP. They actually have to go through as their cloud service offering and achieve that FedRAMP status as well. So there's definitely, it's definitely a nuanced and complex conversation. But again, think about if CUI is going outside the organization to external service provider, you got to know where it goes and you need to know their status. So if it's especially if it's a cloud service provider, it's got to be FedRAMP.
All right, thank you, Marcy. Dominga, I'm going to turn to you now for the next question. And that is that we have about 5 minutes left in our scheduled time. We've got lots of questions from the audience. Do we have the ability to go over a few minutes? I want to prioritize the questions as best I can. We can go over a little bit?
Yep, we totally can. So we'll go ahead and start the live Q&A session. We do have one last poll question for the audience, but you can go ahead and start with the first question from the Q&A box while they answer that.
All right, excellent. So I'm gonna turn. The question is from Matt, and he asks, and I'm going to give this to you first, Marcy, because I think you answered this partially before. Are there projects with agencies such as the GSA or NPS considered part of the DoD supply chain? And you talked about before that non-DoD agencies may choose to deploy this.
Right. Correct. They may choose to. We don't know enough. Like the program is not mature enough to know kind of what that looks like long term. I would not expect them to be considered DoD agencies. What the contract is going to look like. There's going to be a specific DFARS clause. So some of y'all may be familiar with like DFARS 7012. That's what drove the contractual requirement to historically comply with NIST 800-171. You're gonna have another DFARS clause that says like, hey, do CMMC. Obviously, it'll say more, but that's the gist of it. And that's going to be DFARS, but that's defense. Like it's not the FAR, it's not the Federal Acquisition Regulation, it's the Defense Acquisition Regulation. So that's a little bit of the nuance. So I would not expect that, at least presently, in federal contracts, but maybe they'll surprise us. I don't know.
Okay, excellent. Next question is coming from the VA, from Trish at the VA. And she asked, Colin, I'll give this to you. When CMMC is implemented, how does it impact our Kahua workspace? So she's asking a question specifically about Kahua. More specifically, she asked, will we gain or lose functionality when CMMC is implemented?
So for the VA, again, it goes back to what Marcy was just talking about, is the CUI. So for your controlled and classified information, when you implement that, you need to make sure that you follow requirements. There are some customer responsibilities. And so if you're doing administration of roles and vetting who's allowed to see it, how you onboard them, there are going to be controls you need to adhere to for that. For other parts of the system, I'm going to say no, because our system, again, is FedRAMP moderate, meets all the controls to date, and those, the majority of them, especially almost, I believe it's going to be all the technical controls, you can inherit them in CMMC. So you aren't going to have a change in functionality from our end because all of our functionality is available. However, if you're dealing with CUI, you do have CUI-specific controls, which are also there under FedRAMP moderate, by the way. They're not just something that's new for CMMC. So how you handle CUI data needs to be following the control requirements.
Okay, so this really doesn't affect the functionality inside the Kahua product. Okay.
Correct.
All right. So next question then, what would you suggest a customer uses to document CRM items? Can those items be documented in one's SSP? Should the customer have a cybersecurity baseline with data flow for each FedRAMP cloud providing detailing CRM responsibilities? That's a long question. And I will throw that out to any of you three.
I'll tackle one piece first, and then I will say that when you are, we've seen it actually done different ways. If you're a federal agency, you're going to need to have an authorization. You may have your own agency authorization, and you may have your own SSP that you are developing. And what we see is the agencies develop, they actually model their SSPs off of the FedRAMP SSPs. They take the control and the actual control requirements, and then the implementation for the customer responsibility, then detail how they're doing it, just like we do in our own SSP, which is 1,800 pages of controls and what here's requirements, how is it implemented? And then again, for us, we say what your control responsibilities are that you must do. And on the flip side, the agencies come along and say, here's how we've actually implemented our customer responsibility. So I'd say from an agency's perspective, yes, you would be modeling it and documenting it in your own SSP. You're going to be basing it off of what we say the customer responsibility is from Kahua, if it's a control that's required for CMMC that you need to adhere to, such as the CUI side of things, like, hey, having an onboarding process for folks that are allowed or not allowed to see CUI. So I believe that answers the question more for kind of a technical, how it would work with Kahua. And Marcy, Tim, you got anything to add?
So, I mean, I can give my perspective on this, that, certainly when you're looking at, and this is not just pertaining to those CRM, I think, certainly any sort of direction you take, because for instance, if you had multiple cage codes for an assessment, you have multiple SSPs and they're intertwined in some way. Let's say you have an enterprise SSP and you're inheriting some controls for that for a given business unit or program, and that's a part of the scope. There isn't necessarily a right, a wrong way on how you document those. And that goes back to the CRM. What I will say is that you can enlist the help of those RPOs we referred to earlier. They specialize in the space of being able, they see these all the time. They build these packages. They find tools to be able to go in and to be able to automate some of the complexities and administrative maintenance associated with that and get you to something that may work for your organization. Because depending on your assessment scope, given how many locations, how many cage codes, SSPs that you may have, the answer may be different. So I think you really have to look at it from that lens and try to enlist what may be right for you.
All right. Thank you, Tim. That's helpful. I'm going to take one more from the audience, and then we'll do some wrap-up questions and provide some resources. So thank you all for staying with us. So the question, and by the way, thank you to Jeffrey from Floor for that last question. This comes from Patrick from BAE Systems. Any thoughts on high impact level, for example, 4+ programs where FedRAMP certification is not necessarily enough to meet all ITAR requirements? And whoever answers that might tell me what ITAR requirements are.
I will jump in for a little bit. So ITAR is very broad, right? It covers a lot of different areas. It's primarily around the idea of like export controlled information, data sovereignty, U.S. persons access to specific types of data. ITAR is like a subset of CUI, so like ITAR specified would be like an additional label. And so I think it's a really good question. And you're kind of, I think, poking a little bit at some of the potential conflict between what we see in DFAR 7012 for allowing CUI versus, or allowing processing of CUI versus what we see in like the DoD cloud computing SRG. There are some interesting notes on that. So anyway, really, we have seen when we're asked to do like an ITAR assessment over like specific clauses within ITAR, we're usually focused on U.S. persons. We're usually focused on the data sovereignty, those types of aspects. And so those map really nicely to NIST controls that we're already testing as part of the FedRAMP moderate baseline. Obviously, there are some in the FedRAMP high, IL4, IL5 overlays and baselines that also cover those controls. But there's good coverage. We can definitely talk more on this. When people say ITAR, it's pretty broad. So I think being able to have like a more detailed contextual conversation really helps just to make sure that we're getting to the meat of it.
That's fair. And that sets me up well for the next couple of questions for you guys, the last couple of questions, actually. Colin, we'll start with you. And I'm going to start, my son is a professional podcaster. He always ends his podcast with this same question. Where can people go if they want to learn more about this topic? What would you recommend? So Colin, I'm going to ask you that and ask you just, what would you recommend to people if they want to learn more about FedRAMP and the process we went through to help provide this level of security?
So we are going to be providing some links here as part of our webinar and just getting some of the public information out there, because the government does have literally a wealth of information on everything we talked about, and all these acronyms, all these numbers and what they mean. So we'll give that out as for the publications for doing some reading. And what I'll say is specifically for us, and there's some questions we didn't get to in here, and I hope for those that ask things specifically about Kahua or about Schellman, if you answered yes to being contacted, we would love for you to talk to us about and give us and talk about your questions you may have. We're happy to talk about FedRAMP, talk about CMMC, and about how we've either implemented or just general questions you may have. And if not, there are staying up. Again, the government is, I would say, number one with the links that we give, but things should be constantly being again for some final the final program here, at least for 2.0, is coming out here soon in the requirements. And so things are going to jump quickly in phase 1. So you need to be tapped into something that's going to, some of the channels out there, again, through the links that we'll give about when those things are required. But again, we love having you talk to us, whether it's me personally, my contact information, we'll share that here. Feel free to reach out to me or Ian on our team. You can be well versed in all these things with FedRAMP, whether it's a moderate or, and it kind of relates back to that ITAR question here. We are pursuing DoD IL2 and 4. We'll be IL2 4, but IL4 is going to happen in about the middle of next year or earlier. And we actually are looking to go in higher levels of the DoD and their compliance programs. So again, that would be how I would answer that. Again, I'll stress the links that we give you will be great for just general knowledge, but you might have a lot of questions, so you're going to need to be in contact with someone you can bounce those off of. Because again, this is not easy to navigate. Talked about the process to start. That for us, it was a lot of questions to our advisors. And then also during assessment, we still had questions. And even finally with the PMO, again, when they looked at the system, they had a lot of questions. We had answers, and that's how we got to our authorization state of today.
So there'll be a wealth of information for folks to read about. But if they want to talk to someone who's had their knuckles bloodied going through the process, you're willing to take a call.
Yeah, I'm checking them. They definitely are.
All right, excellent. So I'll give this last one to Tim, but Marcy, you weigh in if you'd like. What would you advise a DoD contractor who's unsure of this process? How do they get started? And again, where do they go for more information?
Yeah, so in terms of getting started, I think, certainly some of those areas we talked about earlier with those scoping guides, the assessment guides, that can really help to frame some of that. Talking to professionals in the industry. So when we talk about the ecosystem, those, registered practitioner organizations, those RPOs, us, as a C3PO, there's a lot of information out there that, and certainly it can be, hard to digest at times. And I think that's why we have these webinars, to be able to help break down some of those barriers and roadblocks. But what I will say is that, defense contractors are used to seeing certain guidance in various forms, whether that's DoD instruction, DoD manuals, or directive type memos that dictate policy. Now, there's no indication at this point that that would be coming out for something related to CMMC. But what I will say is that we keep referring to the Title 32 rule. And that really is the authoritative source to everything we're referring to here today, as well as the other Title 48 rule that is a proposed state now. But Title 32 being finalized, that has a lot of good information. I know it's large, there's a lot of content in there, it can be hard to digest. And that's why it's good to be a part of these conversations. But at the end of the day, that is the source of truth, and really understanding what's required of you out of those documents are important.
Tim, Marcy, again, if someone wants to talk with a real human person that's gone through these processes, are you willing to take a call?
Yeah, absolutely. You can hit, if you go to the contact us on our website, it's the fastest, easiest way to get stuff routed to us. Also, obviously, active on LinkedIn, all those fun things. But certainly, either way, we're happy to connect and would look forward to chatting.
All right. If audience, if you put a question in the last few minutes and we did not get to answer it, we will do our best to get back to you. Marcy, Tim, Colin, thank you all so much. I think this has been helpful to our audience, and I'm going to turn it over to Dominga for the last bit of housekeeping. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our speakers for participating in today's discussion, and our audience for joining us today and bearing with us through the audio issues. We will be sending out the recording for you to review or share with your coworkers, along with those additional links Colin mentioned. If we didn't get to your question, like Nicholas said, we will be following up with you. And again, thank you guys for being here today, and we'll see you on the next one.